All right, welcome everybody. This is Dr. Waite, and this video is going to be covering our week 2 reading content from the textbook. We're going to be looking at chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4 is the shoulder girdle, so kind of an introduction to the shoulder and its structure. And then chapter 5, we'll get into the shoulder joint itself, and we're going to look at muscles and movement of the joint. I'm going to make this video a little bit shorter than last week's video due to uploading the videos and getting them posted and so forth. So I'm going to try and keep this presentation somewhat brief and leave it up to you to work your way through the PowerPoint presentations. There's multiple slides on each chapter. And again, these PowerPoints are resources for you to direct your attention to what you should be looking at in the text. The text is kind of supplemental for reading. The PowerPoint really hone ins on the key aspects of each chapter. So let's get into chapter 4 first on the shoulder girdle. Just kind of an overview, looking at the shoulder. This is basically the upper extremity, the joint of the upper extremity that is most dependent on for upper body movement, and directly connected to our axial skeleton through the thoracic and cervical region of the spine. So first area to look at is on slide 3 at the bones. The main bones that we're looking at here at the shoulder joint are going to be our scapula and our clavicle. That's actually serving, I'm sorry, not the shoulder joint, that's serving the shoulder girdle, which supports the joint, right? In the next chapter, we'll add the humerus, the head of the humerus, into the glenoid cavity, which forms our glenohumeral joint, which is the actual shoulder joint itself, the biaxial, multiaxial ball and socket joint. So the key thing about the scapula and the clavicle is that they are connected at the acromion and acromioclavicle joint, where basically the distal end of the clavicle meets the acromion process of the scapula. Okay. Some landmarks to keep in mind here: the bony landmarks where things attach, such as our tendons and our ligaments, to hold the joint together and attach to muscles to help us move. The main ones are the manubrium, the clavicle, coracoid process, acromion process, glenoid fossa, the lateral border, inferior angle, and medial border. And this is found on slide 4. Okay, I'm going to kind of move through here. You can spend some time looking at the images that are provided on each bone. You have the scapula, you have the clavicles. Then it shows an image of a guy and his shoulder joint, or the girdle. So kind of pointing out the bony parts that you can actually palpate yourself and find on yourself. So the sternoclavicle joint, or SC, or sternoclavicular joint, is classified as a multi-axial arthrodial joint, meaning it's freely movable. It connects to the head of the humerus, which is where our biaxial movement occurs, or multi-axial movement, really, because of ball and socket joint. Some key areas here to keep it in consideration is the structure of the girdle itself, which is supported by ligaments that are connecting bone to bone, versus the tendons that are connecting to the muscle. Then it goes on to describe the acromioclavicular joint, where the clavicle meets the acromion process, and the scapulothoracic joint as well. Some movements to keep into consideration. So start working through the movements here. Recognize that our movements at the shoulder girdle mostly depend on the movement of the humerus and how the scapula follows the movement of the humerus. Okay. So a couple big ones: we have abduction and protraction, and also adduction and retraction, which are occurring simultaneously. And then we have upward rotation and downward rotation. The way I like to think, then we also have depression and elevation. You can't skip those as well. But the way I like to think about the movement of the shoulder itself is, think of the scapula and the clavicle being joint twins, right? And they're best friends with the humerus, right? Sometimes I like to describe the scapula as being married to the humerus. Wherever the humerus goes, the scapula follows, right? So the key concept here is wherever one joint moves, the other has to follow because they're connected. In most cases, is wherever we reach for things to either to push away or to pull at, the scapula follows. So if we reach up, the scapula is moving upward. We reach down or we pull down, the scapula is going to move downward. Same as if we reach forward and then back, it's protracting and retracting. Or if we grab something from below and pull it up, we're elevating and then depressing to let back down. Okay, so key movements there. It gets into movements of tilting and so forth within the joint, and then it talks about the synergy between the scapula and shoulder joint, which I just discussed. Big things are when you move on to muscles. Some of the key muscles that we're going to be looking at, starting on slide 27, gets into the trapezius, the rhomboid, the levator scapula, the serratus anterior, and the pectoralis minor. All right, so those are some key ones to look at. Each slide gives a breakdown of each one, where it's connected, so take some time to look at those images, a little review of anatomy. Insertion origin points are important because why? When we know where the insertion and the origin regions are of each muscle, we can determine its line of pull, therefore knowing how it moves the bony structures and in which plane of motion. So in the anterior location, we have our pectoralis minor, which is doing abduction, downward rotation, depression, and our subclavius is performing depression. Posterior, we have our trapezius, multiple jobs of the trapezius, mostly elevation and upward rotation movements, and then the rhomboids and the levator scapula. Okay, if we're moving on down, there's some slides on the nerves. It gives you some images of where nerves innervate through the joints coming from the head and neck region down. Okay, and you can see where each branch of the nerves innervate which muscles. There's a couple slides on 33 and 34 on those. Then it starts to break down each muscle itself. We have the trapezius muscle, and it's showing the insertion and origin, some great images in the text for that, and the different movements that occur. Levator scapula, the rhomboids, serratus anterior, pectoralis minor, subclavius. Okay, and then it gets into the actual motions itself. So it gives you an overview of the muscle, shows you its line of pull and where it's located, how to find it on the body. Then it's going to get into the actual actions itself on slide 41, looking at scapular abduction. Okay, and it shows the agonists. What are agonists? Agonists are the main movers, right? They're the muscles that are moving and causing the action. So pectoralis minor and serratus anterior are the scapular abductors. The adductors agonists are the middle trapezius, lower trapezius, and our rhomboid muscles, right? Upward movement, same with the middle and lower traps, and then with addition to the serratus anterior because of its line of pull. Going into scapular elevation, our main movers, levator scapula, right behind the neck, and the upper trapezius, as well as middle trap and rhomboid also assist in that movement of elevation, whereas depression would be the opposite. It'd be the pectoralis minor coming from underneath the major pec, connecting to the back of the scapula, or front side of the scapula, I guess you could say, anterior aspect of the scapula, along with the lower trapezius pulling from those lower fibers. Okay, and there's, of course, some websites with some great tips on interactive videos and movement of each of those muscles. So let's get into the fun part. On chapter 5, we've got the shoulder joint. Shoulder joint's fun to look at because now we're getting into the actual movements of the humerus. I'm going to get right into it. If you go into the bony section, the bones listed on slide 4 of chapter 5. The major landmarks we're looking for, we have scapular landmarks and humeral landmarks. These are going to be where the attachments of each muscle can be located, determine line of pull. Okay, moving on to the joint itself, it is a multi-axial ball and socket joint, which means what? That means that it moves in all three planes of motion, right? What are they? Sagittal, right? Flexion, extension. We have frontal, which is abduction, adduction, and then we have transverse, horizontal abduction, horizontal adduction. Okay. By the way, if you ever get confused about abduction and adduction, if you haven't figured it out by now, adduction means bringing the limb back towards the middle line of the body. And the way I think of it is it's spelled ADDUCTION, which means add. So if you ever get confused, just remember adduction means you're adding the limb back to the midline of the body. That stuck with me when I learned it in undergrad. It stuck with me ever since. And here I am 8 years later still using this as an example. So adduction, adding the limb back, okay? Okay, so some structures to look at. There's a little bit of information on the labrum, the glenoid labrum, helping with the stability and also movement and function of the glenohumeral joint. I'm going to move beyond the ligaments, which are basically really looking at the stability and structure of the joint itself, what keeps the humerus of the head in the joint. You can see the different ligaments listed there. Talks about degrees of motion, what is ideal degrees of motion. Those of you going into physical therapy, this is a really important aspect to look into because of rehab and functional movement. Okay, and then we get the, on slide 16, there's a pairing of the shoulder girdle and joint itself and what movements occur. Take a look at, on the left side, you have the shoulder joint actions. On the right side, we have the girdle joint actions. And remember, they're paired together, the synergy concept. Wherever the humerus goes, the scapula follows, right? Okay, so it talks a little bit about rhythm. We've already talked about that. Get into more of the stability factor. We have the rotator cuff and the muscles that are associated with that. These include the subscapularis, the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor muscles. Those collectively form the four rotator cuff muscles, which add stability to our shoulder joint. Okay, main motions to take a look at. If you look at movements on slide 22, you have abduction, so lateral movement, taking the limb away from the body in the frontal plane or lateral plane. We have adduction, bringing it back in. Flexion is from the anatomical position, moving the arm straight forward in the sagittal plane, or lifting the arm up, so you could say, is flexion. Extension, pulling back down to the body. And then you have the horizontal or transverse plane motions of adduction, adding the limb to the midline of the body, and then abduction, pulling it away. Okay. You also have rotation, so you can have external rotation, rotating away from the midline of the body, and then internal rotation, rotating back towards the inline of the body. Then it gets into the movements of diagonal motions, and then it talks about the muscles. Now, getting into the muscles, I'm not going to talk too much about this as a kind of review of anatomy, but please do take a look at it, freshen up on it. You have anterior and superior muscles on the front and the back, connecting to the shoulder girdle and into the upper arm region. Then you have posterior that it looks at. It talks about nerves quite a bit. But then we get into the main movers. So if you go down to slide 38, these are the main movers of the shoulder joint. Big ones, deltoids. Deltoids are broken up into three muscle groups. You have your anterior and posterior fibers, and then you have your middle deltoid fibers. So anterior in the front, posterior in the back, and middle. Collectively, they can work to abduct the shoulder. All right. But individually, they also help to horizontally adduct and horizontally abduct as well in the transverse plane. Then moving on, we have our pectoralis major muscle, which are the big boys in the front, right? The pecs. Big movers, those are the big horizontal or transverse plane movers, primarily in horizontal adduction, also assists in flexion and so forth. Moving on, we had on the back side, we had the latissimus dorsi, our big wings back here on the back side of the ribs underneath the scapula, and they're pulling the humerus down basically to perform adduction and help with some rotational movements as well. Teres major also plays a big role in this, works together closely with the latissimus dorsi. And then you can get into the coracobrachialis muscle, which is helping to flex and adduct and horizontally adduct the arm. Now, digging a little bit deeper into the shoulder joint itself, more deep joint connections. You have your supraspinatus and infraspinatus, and then on the backside, the teres minor and subscapularis. Collectively, they're forming the rotator cuff muscles. Not big in movement, but you do need a good amount of strength, and they're important for muscular endurance. So you endurance athletes that are using the joint for a long period of time, fatigue factor starts to set in. So training these muscles is important in that realm. And then it goes into what each of those muscles does primarily as far as its function. And then further beyond the muscles, now it gives an explanation of each action. So there's two ways you can go about studying this material. You can look at the muscles themselves and look at their insertion and origin points and see their line of pull and what plane they're moving in, or you can look at the action and see what muscles perform the action. I like to study from both perspectives because either way it's the same material. You're just looking at it from, okay, what muscles are causing this specific action, or when this action occurs, what muscles are involved. It works both ways. So I recommend studying from both perspectives. Start with the muscles, understanding their specific movement, where they're located, being able to visualize the muscles on the body, and then start looking at their line of pull and so forth. Okay. On the rest of the slides, all the way from the start of glenohumeral flexion on slide 52, it goes through each of the movements all the way through slide 61. So a good amount of slides, close to 10 slides on just the actions themselves, and there's close to 10 slides that show each description of each muscle. And then it follows up with some websites for supplemental reading as well. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can email me anytime. Otherwise, keep digging into the text. Keep looking through these slides. There's some really good stuff. Another tip that I recommend, go to the weight room. When you're in the weight room, don't just lift weights. Think about what you're doing when you're lifting the weights and what the purpose is. What does each exercise serve as far as strengthening specific muscle groups and joints and range of motion and flexibility and so forth. So really dig into it. Be a student of movement. All right. Until next time, take care.